All right, good morning, and thank you so much for joining us at this amazing event about the future of medicine. So I'd like to thank the Boston Globe, in particular, for hosting a session on the future of vaccines. And you'll see we have a very illustrious panel behind you to talk about where we go, in particular with future potential pandemic pathogens. So I think it's especially remarkable given that just 3 years ago, this kind of event, in person, none of us masked, would have been unthinkable. So we have come an incredibly long way, and I'm so excited to hear where we may go in the future. So my name is Jacqueline Miller. I was responsible for vaccine development during the pandemic at Moderna, and am now the company's chief medical officer. I'm really thrilled that we will be talking about the second most effective public health intervention after the development of technologies to clean water. Let's hand it over to Rob Weisman. He's the Boston Globe reporter for biotechnology and health, and this amazing panel that will tell you more about where we go from here. Thank you.
Thanks, Jackie. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm Rob Weisman, the Globe's Biotech and Life Sciences reporter. We have a great panel this morning to discuss the next generation of vaccines. Vaccines are a public health anchor, a growing focus of medical research, and a lightning rod in our politics. We recently witnessed the warp speed rollout of COVID vaccines that saved millions of lives during the pandemic, but their impact was partly blunted by vaccine hesitation and resistance. We're also seeing important innovations in the field, with vaccines used in combination and deployed against cancers and other disease targets. We're lucky to have some of the top infectious disease specialists right here in Boston to shed light on these trends, and three of them are on our panel. Dr. Naheed Badalia, founding director of the BU Center on Emerging Infectious Diseases, Dr. Dan Baruch, the William Bosworth Castle Professor of Medicine at Harvard Medical School and director of the Center for Virology and Vaccine Research at Beth Israel Deaconess Hospital, and Dr. Jacob Lemieux, principal investigator in the Division of Infectious Diseases at Mass General and assistant professor of medicine and microbiology at Harvard Medical School. Welcome all. We're going to address the elephant in the room, an incoming administration in Washington staffed with vaccine skeptics. But first, I want to ask our panelists to provide some context based on what they've been working on. Naheed, you were on the White House COVID response team, helped to coordinate global response programs. With the benefit of hindsight, what did we get right in response to the pandemic, and what will be different and hopefully better in the response to the next pandemic?
Well, it's too bad it's only 20 minutes because I could probably talk for days on that. But Rob, thank you for that question. I actually had two responsibilities at the White House response team, COVID response team. One was managing the president's commitment for us to be the biggest donor of COVID-19 vaccines. The U.S. was the single biggest state donor, about 700 million vaccines donated globally. And I also was the White House liaison for Project NextGen, which is an HHS $5 billion program looking at next generation coronavirus, beta coronavirus vaccines in particular, as well as enabling technologies. When I think about how we weigh our past response and what we could do better, I break that into, particularly for vaccines, four categories. One is availability, one is affordability, one is accessibility, and one is acceptability. So in terms of availability, anybody in this room will agree that we did an incredible job in ensuring that the technologies that we'd invested decades into could be quickly mobilized, whether it be the advances on the RNA side, whether they be finding the right epitopes on the coronavirus to approach when the spike protein is an effective approach. We did a great job of getting what we had already done at the desktop into production. The second part of what we did really great is just having the science is not enough. Having the candidates is not enough. What it takes is someone to make a commitment that regardless of whether the vaccine fails or succeeds, that they're going to purchase a certain number of vaccines, right? Take it to market, invest in that production, get into efficacy trial, and then promise a purchase of a certain amount of technologies. Operation Warp Speed, interestingly, during the first Trump administration, did a pretty effective job of creating market demand for vaccines and getting multiple technologies, more shots on the board to make sure that we get something that's timely in people's hands. We did also a pretty good job of potentially rolling out that vaccine here in the United States, despite the fact that we've not held mass vaccine campaigns for a very long period of time, since polio. We've not done that. Where we potentially could have done better as a global community is that we did not make those vaccines available more quickly to the rest of the global community, right? Most of the countries in the continent of Africa were about a year behind us in getting their first shots. And when those vaccines actually got there, many of the challenges were beyond just getting number of doses into countries. They were about having vaccine technologies that survive that last mile, the need for cold chain, the ability to deliver a vaccine that potentially in the future maybe doesn't even need healthcare workers. Rather than needles, you could have patch, right? Some of our development and our rush to get to the most effective vaccines, perhaps one of the things that we could do better next time is vaccines that are creating greater accessibility. And that doesn't just apply to the global community, also applies to places here in the US that are more rural, right? Not just thinking about the needleless patch vaccines or those that are heat stable, but also vaccines. You have to give thought about accessibility to even things like how many doses you put in a vial. Because if clinics think that they're going to waste majority of the doses, right, they may not get new vaccines and stock them, particularly if they're paying for it and if they don't think there's a demand for it. So those three things I'll start with. Then there's the acceptability part, which probably relates a little bit to your elephant in the room. What we have noticed over the last 4 years is truly even more growing trend of anti-vax sentiment. It was already there before we went into COVID-19 pandemic. What you saw was that politicization of the COVID-19 vaccines. And now, public health is politics. There's always going to be politics in public health. That's how it is, and that's what happens. However, politicization is when you can create that bipartisan sort of tug and pull, which unfortunately the successes of the first Trump administration to getting those vaccines were kind of lost, partly in creating that politicization, and it linked to the growing global challenge that the WHO has recognized around anti-vax sentiment. What's happened is that growing sentiment has now not just affected COVID-19 vaccines, but all vaccines. We've seen record parental exemptions for measles vaccinations. If you project the next 10 years and how that's going to play out, we're going to start to see more and more pockets of preventable diseases where parents are not vaccinating their kids. You're seeing drop in influenza vaccines specifically for pregnant women, which is very alarming because that's a high severity potential population. That's a lot of all of those things I think we're going to have to learn how to do better. That goes beyond just having the science at hand or doing everything you can to create the market levers to get the product. It's going to be those last mile challenges, including uptake and acceptability.
And just a quick follow-up, when you talked about getting ready for the next pandemic, is there a template or a checklist that's been developed that can be adapted? For all the different aspects that I talked about, I think both within the government and outside in civil society, as well as work by ACT-A, WHO, COVAX, all of those lessons have been important in terms of not just getting the vaccines ready, but how to roll them out. So on the readiness side, one of the things to really pay attention to for disease acts and pandemic priority pathogens is work by CEPI and NIAID to identify priority pathogens and a library of epitopes that would be the best approaches to create new vaccines in the setting of a disease X or a new disease from a known priority virus family. There are approaches that were learned from COVAX in terms of how do we ensure enough stock to the global community at a timely manner.
some of the lessons where that even when, so the lessons of COVID-19 vaccine distribution globally came from H1N1, where basically globally vaccines were not available until the emergency ended. By WHO ended the emergency, and then the vaccines were available for the rest of the global community. COVAX was supposed to create buying power by getting everybody to buy in and say we're going to agree to buy at a particular price so that we all get access at a particular time. The successes were that COVAX did save a lot of lives. Unfortunately, what happened were richer countries got ahead of the line, paid more money for those same vaccines, got access to those vaccines earlier. There was a lag in manufacturing where the demand could not be met for the whole global population. So one of the other things I'll mention in terms of what the next steps that could be better is Project NextGen, one of the things that I mentioned that I'd worked on, not just invested in creating technologies for the vaccines, but also excelling at improving our manufacturing capacity, taking new approaches to be able to manufacture more plug and play rather than doing the more traditional manufacturing approaches that we've done, and in also looking at not just vaccines, but host-directed therapies, which are also immunologically sort of targeted.
Great, thank you. Dan, you've been immersed in vaccine research. What do you expect to see in the vaccines of the future, and how will the patient experience change in the years ahead?
Well, thanks for that question. So first, I think we should reiterate that the current vaccines are astonishingly successful. It is estimated that globally, and there were probably about a half dozen vaccines distributed globally for COVID-19, about 20 million lives were saved in the year 2021 alone by the rollout of about a half dozen different COVID vaccines globally, which is just an astonishing success of scientific and policy work for vaccines. That being said, and the current vaccines are not perfect, and I think vaccines of the future will really build on current vaccine science and trying to improve vaccine technologies of the future to essentially make for a better patient experience. And some of these limitations are probably some contributing factors to the vaccine hesitancy amongst many other problems that we just heard about. So say for three things that I think vaccine science is really trying to improve for vaccines of the future. First is durability. We really want a vaccine to be measured in years and not months. I think that's what patients want. I think that's what public health authorities want. And I think that's that really should be the goal. So there's new vaccine technologies, sustained release formulations, other type of delivery methods that hold promise for making the immune responses of vaccines last for longer periods of time. The classic smallpox vaccine gives lifelong protection. I would say at a minimum we want vaccines to last many years and not just a number of months. Secondly is coverage. We want vaccines that will be broadly covering a certain class of pathogens. So for example, that you won't need to get a different flu vaccine every year or a different COVID vaccine for new strains, but rather vaccines of the future would be ideal if they could cover broad classes of viruses more effectively. And that way, for pandemics of the future, then there would be more likely that vaccines could be made that would cover not only the incipient pandemic virus, but also the variants that will inevitably develop from that. And thirdly is effectiveness and efficacy. And the current vaccines do a very good job of preventing severe disease, which is, I think, the most important goal of a vaccine. But I think a lot of people would like a vaccine that also would block infection. And I think many, if not most of our friends and colleagues received vaccines and still got infected, and then we're questioning, well, what's the purpose of vaccines? And of course, the answer is that, well, you didn't go to the hospital and you didn't die, so the vaccines are extraordinarily effective. But I do think that vaccines of the future should also be focused on preventing even mild clinical disease, and I think that will dramatically improve the patient experience and patient uptake and probably reduce vaccine hesitancy in the process. And there's multiple innovations in vaccine design. For example, vaccines that are aimed at generating mucosal immune responses. In other words, immune responses not just in the bloodstream, but also in the nose and the lungs for a respiratory pathogen or other anatomic sites for other pathogens. And that's sort of a cutting area of vaccine science, a cutting edge area of vaccine science now. So I think vaccines of the future can really build on, I would say, the astonishing success of the vaccines of the current day, but there is room to improve in terms of durability, in terms of coverage, and in terms of overall effectiveness.
Great. Jacob, we've seen waves of misinformation confusing the public in recent years. Can you tell us the story of the Lyme disease vaccine that was pulled from the market because of insufficient demand? What lessons have we learned that could help counter misinformation in the future?
Well, thanks for that question, Rob. One of the things that I do at Massachusetts General Hospital is I run the Lyme disease and other tick-borne diseases clinic. And I see many patients with Lyme disease, and as physicians, one of the things that we always do anytime we make a diagnosis is we ask what is the treatment and how do I resolve this acute episode, but also what can we do to prevent this from happening again? And patients always ask, is there a vaccine? And it's funny because I have to tell them that there used to be a vaccine and it's no longer available. There's a vaccine for dogs, but there isn't any longer a vaccine for humans. We hope that's going to change. The story is a fascinating and instructive one. There's a vaccine targeting a protein in Borrelia burgdorferi, which is the agent of Lyme disease, called OspA. And an OspA vaccine was developed and advanced through clinical trials by SmithKline Beecham at the time in the late 1990s. And it was shown to be safe and effective. So we can make the best technology as a society, but if patients don't embrace it, then it's all for naught. And one of the things that happened with this OspA vaccine, which was called Limerix, is that there was a perception among the public that it provoked autoimmunity. And this was built on some very elegant mouse basic scientific investigations that did show that certain epitopes in certain mouse models could provoke autoimmunity. And there was a concern, which was subsequently not borne out by data, that this vaccine was provoking autoimmunity in humans. As a result, demand plummeted and the vaccine was withdrawn from the market. And so for over 20 years, we've had the situation where there does exist a safe and effective vaccine to prevent Lyme disease, but it's not available. So we need to learn from this because there are now more than one redesigned Lyme disease vaccine which are progressing through clinical trials, including a candidate that's in late-stage clinical trials and has some promising early data. And actually, this epitope that was thought to cause problems has, I think, has been removed. I think mostly for marketing purposes and to avoid this issue. So hopefully we're going to be in a situation where things are different, but we really have to ask ourselves, how do we prevent this from happening again? And I don't think the answers are straightforward. I think we need to do a couple things. One is make the case about how safe and effective vaccines are. We need to be careful about absolute statements like there are no risks or there are no side effects, because people are smart and they can clearly see that every medication has the potential for side effects, and there are rare complications of vaccines, and these differ by vaccines. As Dan mentioned, I mean, the numbers of lives saved by the COVID-19 vaccines are staggering, but I also think we need to do a better job of communicating the stories of lives saved, and this is something that we as physicians are privy to, and because we're seeing patients who are hospitalized with severe disease. And I don't think that we do a good enough job of talking about how devastating some of these disease outcomes can be and how life-saving having a preventive or having effective therapies can be. And I just think of my patients in the Lyme disease clinic who some of them are debilitated. Their lives have totally changed from before they had Lyme disease to after they had Lyme disease. And had there been a vaccine available to them, their lives would look totally different. And I think back to times during the COVID-19 pandemic where during the first wave, the hospitals were overwhelmed with patients who were extremely sick, many of whom were dying, many of whom did die. And if you go to the hospital now, it looks totally different. And it's rare to find someone with severe COVID-19 in the hospital, although there certainly are still cases, and that's another topic, but severely immunocompromised patients and other high-risk groups continue to suffer from disease. So I think there's a lot that we can learn from the Lyme disease experience. I think we need to tell the stories better, and I think we need to avoid absolute statements, but engage with our patients.
Great, thank you. Well, I think you got into a little bit of our elephant in the room, but I'm wondering if I could ask Nahid and Dan very quickly to just what advice would you give to a vaccine czar, RFK Jr., or some other Trump administration official about how to approach vaccinations?
Not a tough question at all, yeah. I honestly think government can play a role in a way that no other part of society can to move technologies from desktop to bench, right, to getting to population. It has to be the government. My advice would be to build on the successes of Operation Warp Speed, to recognize that it's not one and done, and H5N1 is potentially on the horizon as a new threat, and it is a role that only the administration and the government can play, and not doing it probably leads to greater economic and public health costs than potentially investing in it and approaching new threats head on.
Great, thank you. And Dan, last words.
Well, I mean, if I were to give advice to the next administration, it would actually be the same as the current administration and the one before that, which is that the facts need to be communicated clearly and honestly to the public, both the pros and the cons. Things should not be sugar-coated, and things should not be demonized. And I think that every administration has been guilty of some of both of those. And I think I would really give the same advice to each of those administrations. But to build, or rather I would say rebuild public trust, there needs to be open and honest communication, even when those details are uncomfortable. Otherwise, we'll continue to lose the public trust.
Well, I'd like to thank our panelists, and then Jackie will offer some closing remarks.
Thank you all so much for such an engaging conversation. I hope you all enjoyed it as much as I did. I definitely will be going back to my place of work thinking about the 4 A's, so availability, accessibility, affordability, and acceptability. And I think the additional innovations to improving vaccine durability, shelf life storage, and administration techniques, so intranasal, intradermal, also something for us to think about and continue to research. I'm ready to put it in the clinic when you have it. And then finally, I think the importance of really clear and accurate communications to make sure that we continue to build trust, that we talk about the successes of vaccines, and also are quite open and honest about the challenges of vaccines as well. So next, you all have lunch, so I want to invite you to enjoy it. After lunch, please do come back, because actually one of the future vaccine innovations that I'm so excited about is the ability to use a vaccine like medicine that induces your own immune responses to fight diseases like cancer. So my colleague Kyle Holan will be by afterwards to talk about how we've built on that platform, mRNA platform, to develop a neoantigen therapy individualized for cancer patients. So thank you so much.